Yo, what's a crack? I'm glad you're here. Many lifters usually disregard push-ups as an unworthy movement for their training because it's too easy of an exercise, or so they say. However, this derogative description is unwarranted. I'm gonna argue that this pervasive view is more of a misunderstanding and misapplication of the exercise rather than a fair assessment on what this movement has to offer. Think about it. Every time the push-up is depicted in modern bodybuilding circles, it is commonly used as a finisher to be done for ultra-high repetitions just for the sake of getting a massive chest pump, or as part of an gnarly superset in the second part of a workout. These applications are not incorrect whatsoever and have their own merit for sure. I do even employ some of these myself in my own training. However, it is rarely the case that the push-up is regarded as a legit option to be a heavy hitter compound lift comparable to traditional barbell exercises. But why is that? You see, the push-up as we know it has a marketing problem. It doesn't sell well. It is not a very reliable tool to measure our progress. The bench press, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. It is a very intuitive lift when it comes to progressive overload. You are certain that you're getting stronger because you keep adding weight to the bar. The feedback is visually pleasing to your own eyes and socially celebrated by those who care to watch. As a result, it's easy to understand why most gym pros and strength enthusiasts fully embraced the flat bench press when it started to become popular in the 50s. It offered a straightforward way to overload a horizontal press, something the push-up had never been able to do. As more plates were added to the bar in a bench press, the juicier the chesticles got. By the time the golden era of bodybuilding came around, the flat bench press had almost entirely displaced the push-up as a viable option for muscle growth in the upper body. The argument used by lifters back then still echoes to this day. The push-up is simply too easy of an exercise.
Alright, first exercise we're gonna count this as our warm-up. We're gonna do push-ups, 30 reps, and you can break it up any way you want. What?
Today, I'm going to make the case that this opinion is not only misleading, but disingenuous, especially when this message gets pushed out on platforms like YouTube, where you can influence thousands of impressionable beginners who don't know any better. In this episode, I'm going to share a push-up style even advanced trainees could benefit from. In fact, if I was personally forced to pick one push-up to do for the rest of my life, this would be it. So here's the push-up I'm talking about. A more descriptive name would be somewhat of a nightmare for me to refer to throughout this video, so I'm just gonna call it the BILBAO push-up from here on out. After all, I'm using my channel to feature this variation and Bilbao is the city I'm from, so why the heck not? As you can see on the right side, I've listed all the elements that have been modified from the classic version to produce a much harder push-up variation. I'm going to go over these one by one to explain the value of these tweaks and how they could help you in your training. First off, unlike a classic push-up, the BILBAO variation has your feet on an elevated platform so that your body is in a slight decline. Nothing major, a subtle downward lean that is going to emphasize the upper portion of the chest, just like any 15 to 30 degree incline bench press would. However, when you replicate this angle with a bodyweight exercise like the push-up, this means that you're automatically adding resistance to the movement. Now you're going to have to overcome a larger percentage of your own body weight. The second element that is going to make this push-up variant much more challenging is the extra range of motion at the most difficult part of the exercise, aka the bottom. The floor typically limits how far down you can go during a traditional push-up, but this is no longer the case. Implements like the bars you see on the screen allow your body to travel a larger distance from top to bottom, thus creating a greater displacement of the resistance. In other words, not only do you perform a harder push-up in terms of intensity through a heavier load, but you also lengthen the space this heavier resistance has to move across. Double whammy. And if this wasn't enough, a push-up with a deficit could be a friendly introductory movement to expose your shoulder to a high degree of extension, if mobility in this area is something you want to get better at. A slower descent makes a world of difference when compared to the tempo at which most people usually do the exercise. Let me make this very clear, I'm not advocating for a silly time under tension hack based on bro science. Instead, I just want gym rats drinking the Kool-Aid of enhanced bodybuilders to stab the mad half-rep bouncing with no control. Given that now you're putting your shoulder joints in a more compromised position at the bottom range of the movement, A more slow and controlled tempo seems reasonable. When it comes to tempo, the best comparable example I can give you is perhaps the speed at which you would lower the barbell in a flat bench press when you work with high intensity. You don't just let the barbell smash your chest in a free fall. You would typically exercise some degree of control to slow down the negative in order to maintain full body tension. I would invite you to do something similar. Another tool people completely neglect during push-ups is a pause at the bottom. But I get it, if you can do tons of bodyweight push-ups in a row, it'd be silly and unpractical to do so. However, what we are trying to achieve here is to make the push-up as hard as possible so that the number of reps we can do plunges to single digits. That's the goal. With that in mind, and taking into account the additional range of motion, now a pause doesn't seem an outlandish idea anymore. From a hypertrophy standpoint, this also means that we can take advantage of a very acute weighted stretch in the pectoralis muscle. Despite all these previous elements to make a push-up harder, we still need to add resistance to the movement just like you would in a barbell bench press. As I said before, if we are planning on turning a push-up into a lift worth considering for both strength development and hypertrophy, we must overload it with a considerable amount of weight. There's nothing written on stone in this regard, but a good place to start would be to add as much weight to the point where you're only able to do between 6 to 10 reps. There are many ways you can skin the cat in terms of weight placement and implements to bear the load. Even at the risk of oversimplifying this issue, I'm only going to suggest 3 options. Number 1, a good weighted vest. Number 2, sturdy backpack. Number 3, a belt. Depending on how much you can load your weighted vest, you might have to combine this implement with options 2 and 3. In any case, all of them have their own pros and cons. A weighted or a plate-loaded vest is great, but it requires an economic disbursement. The low-cost alternative would be a backpack you can put weight in, although it might feel a little bit uncomfortable if the weighted pieces are not stable inside. And finally, the traditional belt. It is important to point out that the belt requires a more elevated setup so that the hanging weight doesn't come into contact with the ground. Additionally, it makes sense to pick smaller plates over larger ones when you deploy option number 3. In any possible scenario, you would want to place the load on either your upper back or on your chest, not on your midsection. Otherwise, the plank position you ought to maintain throughout the set could be compromised. If you're going to reach failure while doing push-ups in a set, you would want to stop because either your chest, your front delts, or your triceps, not because your core is the limiting factor. Finally, let's analyze the mechanics of the exercise to assess whether the BILBAO push-up is something you might want to try. Given the specific characteristics of the lift, the open kinetic chain equivalent would be a slight incline bench press performed with a Swiss bar that has a mild curve in the middle for an extra range of motion at the bottom. If you can't afford a specialty bar like this, the push-up feature in this video is the low-cost alternative you can whip up to overload your upper body in very similar angles. However, let's face the fact that despite the mechanical equivalence between these two, the push-up version lends itself better to high-rep work, not max effort sets. So if your training style is skewed towards powerlifting, the BILBAO push-up would only make sense in your off-season as an accessory lift when your goal is hypertrophic adaptations. If your training modality is more flexible and leans towards bodybuilding, this movement could potentially be a recurrent lift in your training alongside weighted dips and different versions of the bench press. If you typically work out at home and your training style is very reliant on calisthenics, you could turn the BILBAO push-up into your main horizontal pressing movement for sure. As you can see, the value of this push-up variation heavily depends on your personal preferences and training goals. I'm not here to impose anything on anyone, but rather to offer you an option that could be worth your while. The push-up as we know it doesn't need to be that easy exercise only beginners should be doing. There could be plenty of untapped potential within this staple bodyweight movement if we care to adjust its variables intelligently. Check out these 2 videos, I think you're gonna like them. Please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click on the bell to get notified every time a new video goes live. Stay fit, stay strong, help me raise an army of Super Saiyans all around the world. Peace.